He agreed to switch shifts without hesitation, even though it meant giving up the one day he usually rested. His coworker stood there, anxious, explaining that her son needed to be taken to the hospital, and the single father nodded before she could finish. He didn't mention the overtime he had already worked that week, or the fact that his body ached constantly. Helping someone felt simpler than explaining why he was tired. 2 days later, in the middle of his morning shift, his phone vibrated in his pocket. During a short break, he checked his email and felt his stomach tighten. The subject line read, "Urgent attendance requested." No explanation followed. No details. Just a demand that he come to the school that same day. He stared at the screen longer than he should have, already calculating what leaving early would cost him. He approached his supervisor carefully, choosing his words, explaining that the school needed him immediately. The supervisor listened, nodded, and approved the early exit without raising his voice. Then he turned to the computer, typed something into the system, and said quietly, "That's the second time this week." The words landed heavier than any warning. The father thanked him anyway and clocked out. At the school, he signed his name at the front desk and waited. When his son finally appeared, backpack clutched tightly to his chest, something felt wrong. The boy avoided eye contact and walked too close, almost pressing against his father's leg. On the drive home, the father asked gently if everything was okay. "It was nothing, Dad," the boy said, staring out the window. He said it quickly, as if rehearsed, his fingers still gripping the straps of his backpack. The father nodded, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the unanswered email, and he knew this wasn't nothing at all. The coordinator didn't greet him at the front desk. Instead, she appeared briefly, called his name, and motioned for him to follow. They didn't stop at the office or the reception area. She led him down a narrow hallway and into a small room with no windows, closing the door behind them. The silence felt deliberate, as if the space itself was meant to unsettle him. She sat across from him and folded her hands before speaking. There had been recurring incidents involving his son, she said, choosing her words carefully. Nothing dangerous, nothing dramatic, but concerning enough to require attention. When he asked what exactly had happened, she shook her head slightly and explained that details could only be discussed in a formal meeting scheduled for the next day. Until then, that was all she could say. The father leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. He needed to know if his son was hurt, or if someone else was involved. The coordinator's tone didn't change. "It wouldn't be appropriate to discuss specifics now," she repeated, standing to signal the conversation was over. He realized then that this wasn't about clarity, it was about control. Outside, his son waited on a bench, feet dangling, hands locked together. As soon as they stepped into the hallway, the boy looked up with wide eyes and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" The question hit harder than anything the coordinator had said. The father knelt down, met his son's gaze, and admitted he didn't know yet. But he promised they would come back the next day and figure it out together. That promise stayed with him all the way home, heavier than the long hours ahead and the meeting looming over him. If you've ever felt that quiet tension, when answers are withheld and everything feels uncertain, you'll recognize what comes next. Stories like this unfold in small moments, and if you want to follow how this one develops, consider subscribing so you don't miss the rest. The next morning, the call from the school came earlier than he expected. The number flashed on his phone while he was tying his work boots, and before he could answer, it went to voicemail. The message was short and firm. They needed him to come in again that day for adjustments to the follow-up process. No explanation. No flexibility. Just an assumption that he could leave everything else behind. He stared at the wall for a long moment, then made the decision he'd been dreading. He didn't call his supervisor. There wasn't time for explanations or negotiations. He grabbed his jacket, locked the door, and drove straight to the school. As he parked, guilt settled in, not because of work, but because he knew each absence was quietly adding up against him. By late morning, while he sat in the school hallway, his phone vibrated repeatedly in his pocket. When he finally checked it, there it was, an email from Human Resources. The language was polite but cold, referencing unplanned absences and reminding him of company policy. It ended by requesting clarification regarding his availability and reliability. He felt his chest tighten as he reread it. He typed a response carefully, explaining the school situation, choosing words that sounded responsible rather than desperate. He mentioned being a single parent. He mentioned urgency. He pressed send and waited, refreshing his inbox more than once. The reply came quickly, but it wasn't from a person. It was an automated message, thanking him for his response and instructing him to schedule an in-person meeting. A staff member eventually led him to a classroom where his son sat alone at a desk, coloring silently while the rest of the room buzzed with distant noise. The teacher explained that his son had been removed during a group activity earlier that morning. No incident report was offered. No clear trigger was named. Just a vague reference to monitoring behavior. The father asked what his son had done to warrant being singled out. The teacher avoided his eyes and repeated the phrase he was starting to hate. Standard procedure. When he pressed further, asking who made the decision and why, she said she was following instructions from administration. The conversation went nowhere, looping back on itself. He crouched beside his son and asked him quietly what had happened. The boy shrugged and said he was told to step outside and wait. No argument. No explanation. Just a directive from an adult he didn't question. Hearing that made something tighten in the father's jaw. He thanked the teacher, even though gratitude felt undeserved, and let his son out. In the car, the silence returned, heavier this time. The father's mind bounced between two realities pulling him apart. At work, his absence was becoming a pattern. At school, his presence was being treated like an inconvenience. Both places seemed to expect full compliance, with no room for context or compassion. That evening, after his son fell asleep, he opened his laptop and reread the HR email, then checked the school portal for updates. There were none. Just a reminder of the scheduled meeting and a sense that decisions were being made without him. He realized then that staying quiet wasn't protecting anyone anymore. It was slowly cornering him. As he shut the laptop, his phone buzzed with a new message, this time from a number he didn't recognize. It mentioned the upcoming school meeting and included an attachment. He stared at the screen, unsure whether opening it would finally bring clarity or make everything worse. That night, the house felt smaller than usual. The television was on, but neither of them watched it. His son sat at the edge of the couch, hands folded tightly in his lap, eyes fixed on the floor. After a long stretch of silence, the boy spoke in a quiet voice, barely above a whisper. He said he was sorry. When the father asked what for, the apology came again, softer this time, as if repeating it might make it true. The boy explained it the only way he knew how. If he behaved better at school, the calls would stop. If the calls stopped, his dad wouldn't have to leave work. And if his dad didn't leave work, he wouldn't get in trouble. The logic was simple, heartbreaking, and completely wrong. The father felt something break inside him as he listened, realizing how deeply the pressure had already settled into his child. The next morning, an email from the school arrived before breakfast. Attached was a formal document labeled Recommended Support Measures. It suggested mandatory psychological follow-up for his son, citing emotional regulation concerns. There was a signature line at the bottom, already highlighted. No request for consent. No space for discussion. Just an expectation. He read the document twice, then a third time, searching for specifics that weren't there. The language was vague but heavy with implication. He replied to the email asking what behavior had led to this recommendation and whether an assessment had been conducted. The response came later that day, brief and carefully worded. The signature was recommended to ensure the child's well-being, they said. It would help move things forward. The father felt the pressure closing in from both sides. At work, he was waiting for a meeting that could determine his future. At school, he was being asked to agree to something he didn't fully understand. He printed the form and set it on the kitchen table, staring at it as if it might explain itself. It didn't. That evening, he sat down with his son at the table, pushing the paper aside. He told the boy that none of this was his fault. That adults sometimes make decisions without explaining them well. That being quiet or speaking up didn't make him a problem. The boy listened, tears sliding down his face, shoulders shaking as the weight finally came out. The father pulled him close and repeated it until the words felt real. He told him that jobs could be replaced, schedules could change, but his son couldn't. Slowly, the boy's breathing steadied. The apology stopped. What remained was exhaustion, but also relief. Later that night, after his son fell asleep, the father returned to the kitchen and picked up the form again. He traced the highlighted signature line with his finger, thinking about what agreeing might mean, and what refusing could cost. He folded the paper and slid it into a drawer, unresolved but no longer invisible. Before turning off the lights, his phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for the school meeting. This time, it included additional attendees he hadn't seen before. As he read the list of names, he realized this was no longer just about his son. It was about how far he was willing to go to protect him. The meeting with Human Resources was scheduled for early morning, leaving him no time to prepare anything beyond what he had already rehearsed in his head. He sat across from the HR representative in a small conference room, hands folded, listening as she reviewed attendance records on her screen. Dates were read out calmly, each one marking a day he had left early or hadn't come in at all. When she finished, she looked up and said plainly that one more unplanned absence could lead to termination. He tried to explain again about the school calls, the urgency, the lack of notice, but the explanation landed softly, as if the room absorbed it without reaction. The representative nodded, sympathetic but detached, and reminded him that while the situation was unfortunate, the company still required reliability. She slid a printed summary across the table and asked him to sign, acknowledging the warning. He signed, knowing the ink locked him into a narrowing path. As soon as he returned to his desk, his phone buzzed. This time it was an email from the school confirming the meeting scheduled for that afternoon. The subject line included new wording: multidisciplinary review. Attached was a list of attendees: administration, a psychologist, a behavioral specialist. The scale of it made his chest tighten. What had begun as vague concern now felt formal, permanent. He stepped into the hallway and called the school immediately. He explained that he had just come from an HR meeting and asked if the school could move the meeting to the following day. The secretary placed him on hold, then returned with a polite but firm answer. The meeting had already been arranged. All parties were confirmed. Attendance was expected. He tried again, lowering his voice, emphasizing that missing more work could cost him his job. The response didn't change. They understood his concern, they said, but the matter involved the child's well-being and couldn't be delayed. The call ended with a reminder of the meeting time. No alternatives offered. Back at his desk, he stared at his computer screen without seeing it. Two obligations stood in front of him, both immovable, both demanding his presence. If he stayed at work, he risked being seen as disengaged from his child. If he went to the school, he risked losing the income that kept their lives stable. There was no choice that didn't take something away. He opened his calendar and blocked out the afternoon anyway. Then he stood, gathered his things, and walked toward his supervisor's office. He explained where he was going and why, choosing honesty over strategy. The supervisor listened, sighed, and said nothing for a moment. Then he nodded and told him to go, but reminded him that the absence would be documented. As he left the building, the weight of that word followed him, documented. It meant this wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a record, a mark that could be pulled up later and used against him. Still, he drove straight to the school, arriving early and sitting in his car until it was time to go inside. The conference room at the school was larger than he expected. Chairs were arranged in a circle, folders stacked neatly at each seat. As people began to arrive, greeting each other casually, he realized he was the only one there without a role or title. Just a parent waiting to be evaluated. When the meeting began, introductions went around the room. Each person spoke confidently about their role, their perspective, their concern. When it was his turn, he gave his name and said he was the child's father. Nothing more. The imbalance was clear, and it settled over him like a verdict waiting to be read. As the discussion moved forward, he noticed someone entering late and taking a seat near the door. He didn't recognize her at first, but when she looked up, something clicked. It was someone from his workplace, someone he hadn't expected to see there at all. And in that moment, he sensed that the story everyone thought they understood was about to shift. The coordinator began by outlining concerns in a measured, professional tone. She spoke about consistency, structure, and the importance of routine, occasionally glancing at her notes. A teacher followed, mentioning moments when the child seemed withdrawn. Then the psychologist added her assessment, carefully using phrases like possible absence and instability in the home environment. None of them raised their voices, but together their words painted a picture of a father who wasn't fully there. The father listened without interrupting, hands clasped tightly in his lap. When they spoke about him, they did it in the third person, as if he were a case file rather than someone sitting in the room. Children need predictability, the psychologist said. Frequent changes in availability can be confusing. The phrase absence of paternal presence landed hardest. He felt it settle in his chest, heavy and unfair. He finally spoke, calmly explaining his work schedule and the recent shift changes. He described the calls from the school and the urgency that forced him to leave work. The coordinator nodded politely, but redirected the conversation back to the child's behavior. From their perspective, intent mattered less than impact. The implication was clear. Regardless of effort, the result was still a problem. The door opened quietly, and a woman stepped in, apologizing for being late. She took the empty seat near the door and introduced herself as a parent representative invited to provide outside context. When she looked up, recognition flashed across her face. She hesitated, then glanced at the father again, realizing who he was. As the discussion resumed, she listened closely. When the psychologist repeated concerns about the father's inconsistent presence, the woman raised her hand. She explained that she worked at the same company as the father. That during the week in question, she had personally covered multiple shifts for him, so he could respond to school requests. The room paused, attention shifting toward her. The coordinator thanked her input but said gently that staffing arrangements at work didn't necessarily reflect what the child experienced emotionally. The woman nodded and reached into her bag. She pulled out printed documents, official shift change approvals logged by the company, signed and dated. She placed them on the table and slid them forward. "These weren't last-minute absences," she said. "They were approved adjustments." The psychologist leaned forward, scanning the papers. She asked for clarification on the hours listed, then compared them to the times noted in the school's internal reports. Her brow furrowed. The timelines didn't align. The father hadn't been absent during the periods the school had flagged. The assumption of unpredictability suddenly lacked foundation. A quiet shift moved through the room. The teacher adjusted in her chair. The coordinator stopped taking notes. The psychologist asked when the school had first reviewed the father's actual schedule. No one answered immediately. It became clear that they hadn't. Decisions had been made based on perception, not verification. The father felt the tension change, subtle but undeniable. He wasn't being talked about anymore. He was being listened to. The language softened. Words like oversight and miscommunication entered the conversation. The narrative that had framed him as unreliable began to fracture under the weight of documented facts. The meeting ended without resolution, but the balance had shifted. As chairs scraped back and folders were gathered, the coordinator said they would need to reassess their approach. Walking out, the father caught his coworker's eye and nodded in quiet gratitude. He didn't know what the reassessment would mean yet, but for the first time, the truth was finally in the room, and whatever came next would have to face it. The days after the meeting moved more slowly, as if the tension had drained the urgency out of everything. The school sent a revised report by email, this time written in clearer language. It stated plainly that the child had spoken up when another student was being mocked during a group activity. A raised voice had been mistaken for aggression. The father read the sentence twice, feeling both pride and exhaustion settle in at once. When he returned to the school to sign the updated documents, the atmosphere had changed. The coordinator spoke differently now, choosing careful words and maintaining eye contact. She confirmed that the original record had been corrected and that the incident would no longer follow his son's file. The recommendation for mandatory psychological follow-up was formally withdrawn. The father nodded, thanked her, and felt his shoulders loosen for the first time in weeks. That afternoon, he picked his son up from school without being called into an office or hallway. They walked to the car side by side, and the boy talked freely about his day, mentioning a math quiz and a drawing he'd finished. Before starting the engine, the father told him he was proud of him for standing up for someone else. The boy smiled, small and relieved, as if he'd been waiting to hear that. At home, they made dinner together, something they hadn't done in a while. The father chopped vegetables while his son set the table, their movements unhurried. They agreed on a new routine. No more guessing, no more quiet fear. If something felt wrong, they would talk about it that same day. No waiting. No carrying it alone. Later that night, after his son was asleep, the father sat in the quiet living room and reflected on how close everything had come to breaking. The job was still uncertain, life still demanding, but something important had shifted. He understood now that protecting his child sometimes meant pushing back, even when it felt risky. And for the first time, he believed they would be okay, not because the system worked, but because they faced it together. The following week, the father made changes he had been postponing for years. He spoke with his supervisor and declined extra shifts, even when they were offered quietly as favors. The pay cut stung, but the uncertainty had stung more. He also emailed the school, clearly outlining when he was available, how communication should happen, and what steps were required before pulling his son out of class again. The message was firm, respectful, and no longer apologetic. The school responded differently this time. Calls became emails. Meetings were scheduled, not demanded. When concerns arose, they were explained instead of hinted at. The father noticed the shift immediately. For the first time, he felt like a partner rather than a suspect. It didn't fix everything, but it drew lines that hadn't existed before. His son returned to his routines without hesitation. He raised his hand in class again. He joined group activities without watching the door. The quiet tension that had followed him home each afternoon slowly faded. Teachers stopped pulling him aside. Notes stopped appearing in the backpack. School became what it was supposed to be, a place he went, not a place that followed him. Every afternoon, they began walking a longer route home. Nothing special, just an extra block, sometimes two. During that walk, the father asked one simple question. How was today, really? Some days the answer was short. Other days it spilled out in fragments and stories. Either way, the rule was the same. Nothing stayed locked inside until bedtime. Months later, when the chaos felt distant, the father understood what had changed. He hadn't become more available by being everywhere at once. He had become more present by showing up consistently and standing his ground when it mattered. His son learned that speaking up didn't make him a burden. And together, they learned that stability isn't built from perfect schedules, but from knowing someone will always come back for you.